Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, epoxy. Epoxy? Seriously? Is it possible to think of anything less interesting? Well, look, here's the thing. Epoxy is an adhesive that's used to hold handles on knives, and if the epoxy fails, hey, the whole knife fails. So it's really something that we'd all be well advised to know more about. Now, my specialty as a knife maker is really in the Japanese sword realm, and there's not a lot of reason to use epoxy there. So it's something that I haven't schooled myself on all that much. So a few months back, I spoke with a guy named Andy Deere. Now recently, Andy got interested in knife making and he started marketing some epoxies under the trade name Blade Bond that are formulated specifically for knife makers. So he's shared a healthy dose of insider knowledge with me, and I'm going to pass that along to you. So before turning to what's good and what's not, let's talk a little bit about how epoxies work and how to use them. Epoxies are adhesives. They're typically two-part products, with one being what's known as a resin and the other a hardener. When mixed, they react chemically in such a way as to harden into a sort of plastic-like material. The most common use for knife makers is to attach handle materials to the tangs of blades, but they have a host of other uses. Most consumer epoxies can generally be described as either quick curing, usually marketed as 5-minute epoxy, or slow curing, marketed as 60-minute epoxies. The quick curing type use a hardener known as mercaptan, and the slower curing type use polyamine hardeners. I'm oversimplifying a bit here. There are other hardeners and there are other additives which can slow or speed curing, as well as changing the consistency to make it thicker or thinner, more or less flexible, and so on. But sticking with the most common hardeners, mercaptan hardeners can be generally recognized as clear and rotten eggy smelling, while amines are generally amber colored and less stinky. As a very general rule, the slower curing amine or polyamine type epoxies are stronger. There's a lot of complexity here. Mercaptan-based epoxies may have superior flexibility but inferior hardness, and in some applications that might make for a longer lasting bond. Mercaptan hardened epoxies will also slowly soften after contact with water. Now, I don't want to give the impression that it's like Elmer's. It'll only soften under prolonged exposure to water. But still, a point worth bearing in mind. Now, some quick terminology. You can find a lot of these listed on manufacturer data sheets, which I always recommend that you check out anytime you're using a material in knife making. Pot life means how long the mixed epoxy can sit before it stops being usable. Working time means how long it can sit in a joint before it stops being usable. You'd think they'd be the same, right? But you'd think wrong. The reason for this is that the chemical reaction between resin and hardener creates heat. That heat, in turn, speeds up the curing of the epoxy. So, when the epoxy is sitting in a mixing cup, it'll get gummy and unworkable quicker than it will when it's spread out. Everything's temperature sensitive. So if you're working in a 100-degree garage in Florida or a 45-degree shop in Wisconsin, the numbers listed on the manufacturer's data sheet won't necessarily tell you much. The final number you hear is cure time. Again, temperature dependent. Most manufacturers specify 70 degrees for their times. So if your ambient temperature is different, presume that the colder it is, the longer it'll take for the epoxy to cure. Another point about epoxies is that they degrade over time. Epoxies left on the shelf for months and months won't cure as hard or as quickly as they're supposed to. Early on in my career, I had trouble predicting what exactly epoxies were going to do for me. In retrospect, I realize it's because I kept a lot of them around for too long. If you're in any doubt about how long you've had an epoxy, hey, just dump it and buy some more. Here's another thing to consider. Some epoxies cure very hard, but are somewhat brittle. Again, different formulations will vary. Check out your manufacturer's data sheets to see. Just because an epoxy is rated at a particular strength doesn't mean it's going to be strong in all applications. Moreover, hardness tends to increase shear strength, whereas flexibility increases shock resistance and peel strength. Brands like Loctite, Devcon, JB Weld, and others often market a very wide range of epoxies, but these days I find the so-called 5-minute or quick cure epoxies are much easier to find in hardware stores than the slower curing types. You used to be able to find the 60-minute amber colored types made by the same manufacturers in most big box stores, but my local hardware stores seem to have phased them out in recent years. Devcon's slow cure formula is called 2-ton, and Loctite's is called Extra Time. Loctite, Devcon, and other brands like West System and 3M market more niche-y industrial type epoxies, but you'll have to hunt a lot harder to find them. If you're a hobbyist, you may not want to buy industrially priced epoxies in industrial sized quantities. So the obvious question is whether you would want to use consumer type epoxies at all, and the second question is, if not, what would you want to use? Well, look, I'm not going to answer that question just yet. I'm going to do a second video where I test a bunch of epoxies and you can kind of draw your own conclusions there. The most important thing to understand is that no matter what kind of epoxy you use, surface preparation is the key to success. Andy Deere of Blade Bond says it's 80% of the game no matter what kind of epoxy you use. Here's the drill. You want to use epoxy on surfaces which A, are completely free of oil and grease, and B, have as much tooth as possible. So let's walk through what that means in practice. The first step in surface prep, you need to degrease the surface of whatever material you'll be using. Totally critical. If you're attaching handle scales, that means you want to either use a degreasing solvent like acetone or good old soap and water. Personally, I use dishwashing soap, rinsing very thoroughly once I'm done so that I can see water beading up on the surface of the steel. When I do this, I'm always very, very careful not to touch anything with my fingers after cleaning, and I dry it immediately with a clean, dry paper towel. Now, dry woods like maple don't need any degreasing, but oily woods like cocobolo have a much better chance of adhering if you clean them with a strong solvent like lacquer thinner. Man-made materials like micarta, plastics, carbon fiber, and so forth can be cleaned with a solvent. After degreasing, the next step is to scuff up the surfaces that you'll be epoxying. This creates a tooth to the surface, which not only increases surface area on a microscopic level, but it gives a more 3D surface for the epoxy to cling to. I always used to do this with sandpaper, but Andy recommends using purple 3M Scotch-Brite. The purple type Scotch-Brite pads contain a fairly coarse abrasive, but according to Andy, they're less likely than sandpaper to dig into the surface and create depressions in the material that might cause uneven distribution of the epoxy, which in turn will weaken the bond. Makes sense to me. Once you've Scotch-Brited the surface, blow it off with compressed air or wipe it quickly with a completely oil-free paper towel. Then don't do anything else. In particular, Andy cautions not to ever use a solvent after scuffing the surface. The reason for this is that solvents may have ingredients that will contaminate the surface. Once everything's cleaned up, you want to go ahead and glue things as quickly as possible after surface prep. The longer they lie around, the more likely they are to accumulate dust or to oxidize, creating a barrier between epoxy and metal. Another point is that all epoxies are made to be mixed at a specified ratio, generally, but not always, 1-to-1. Whatever the ratio is, you want to be very careful to stick with it. Changing the ratio can not only cause changes in cure time, but can also cause the epoxy to cure to less than optimal strength. So, be as careful as you can to follow the manufacturer's recommendations about mix ratios. It's easier to keep your mix ratio correct if you're making larger quantities than if you're making just a tiny little bit. Once the epoxy's been spread, it should be clamped up. As with any glue, clamp it firmly, but don't clamp it to death. If you squeeze every last little bit of epoxy out of the joint, it's less likely to hold. Now, as far as clamp time goes, different epoxies require different amounts of clamping, so follow the manufacturer's directions. As with any glue, be aware that even after a glue has gotten fairly tacky, things will continue to creep or move around if the clamps are exerting force in the wrong direction. And if they're prematurely removed, the parts can shift just under the force of gravity. So, some general points about epoxies. First, epoxies cure faster when they're warmer. Curing most epoxies in an environment in the realm of 110 degrees Fahrenheit will result in a much faster cure time. Likewise, using epoxy in your unheated shop in Minnesota will be pretty slow in midwinter. Too much heat, on the other hand, can actually degrade the bond, so don't overdo the heating if you're trying to force the cure. So that's where I'm wrapping up part 1. The takeaway here: surface prep, surface prep, surface prep. Too oily, too slick, epoxy's just going to crap out on you. Okay, so you're probably long past the point where you want me to say, here's the epoxy that you should buy. Well, before I even vaguely suggest that, let's do some testing. For that, we'll need to check out part 2 of this video series.